good to be with you this morning. It's fun to see so many young people here in this service, but I'm about to talk to you like an old person. And what I want to tell you is that I have terrible eyesight. Terrible. I mean, I'm not just saying that I don't see particularly well. I mean, without the aid of glasses or contacts, I can see nothing. It's horrible. I found this out when I was in first grade, second grade. My parents took me to the eye doctor, and they got me glasses and contacts. And what's interesting about that to me is that means I went about 7 years not knowing that there was a whole bunch of stuff that I couldn't see, right? I'm surprised I wasn't walking around bumping into walls and falling off bridges like Mr. Magoo or something like that. I remember after I got glasses and contacts, there would be times where I would sit and watch the TV, and when I was young, TVs tended to be smaller than they are now and way deeper than they are now. Those of you who are young don't know what I'm talking about. But the TVs were kind of smallish, and so I would have to sit close to it. And my mom would say something like this to me, like, she'd say, "Don't stand too close to the TV, it's gonna ruin your eyesight." And I was like, "Too late, Mom, you did this to me. Your DNA made me a blind person, it's horrible." And as I've gotten older, it's only gotten worse. Every time I go to the eye doctor, it's just humiliating. And I know you guys can relate with me about this, but I go to the eye doctor and they put an eye test up on the board, like the one that I'm gonna display to you here, and they give you that little eye thing to cover your eye. Now, this is a spoon my son used to eat yogurt yesterday, but it's the closest I could get. But I cover my eye, and he makes me take out my contacts, and he says, "Tell me what you can see." He'd say, "Pick the smallest line you can read and read it." And so I told you, I can't see anything. So I've covered my eye, and I'm looking at it, and I squint, and I'm looking at like the top line because I can't see anything, and I have to start guessing. I'm like, A7, fish, Egyptian hieroglyphic. I can't see anything. It's humiliating. But after that happens, many of you have experienced this, the eye doctor starts to put lenses in front of your face, right? He puts them there, and he starts flipping them. And as he flips through the lenses, the things that are blurry to me, they start to become clear, right? I can read a lower line and actually see what it says. But what's even crazier to me is that as the eye doctor keeps flipping, it gets to the point where all of a sudden I can see lines that I didn't even know existed in the first place. It wasn't even that it was blurry and now I can see. It's that I literally did not know it was there. My eye could not pick up what was going on in front of me. And it makes me wonder occasionally, what would my life be like if glasses and contacts had not been invented? So for one hand, I definitely couldn't drive. Like I told you, I'm a blind person. I wouldn't be able to read very well. In fact, it would probably be hard for me to even do something simple like cooking or cleaning in my house safely. And my wife, she's not here, but she would tell you, I probably don't do that much anyway, even when I can see. But that doesn't matter. That's neither here nor there. So there are things that exist that I just can't even see with my eye. It's pretty interesting when you look at how the human eye behaves, the way that God designed it, when it works properly. I have a little graphic for you here to see what the eye looks like. This is called a GIF. There's a raging debate over whether it's called GIF or GIF, but apparently GIF is the right answer. I was calling it GIF for years. Anyway, this shows you what the human eye does. Now, you looking at me right now, if you're looking at me, you are seeing light reflecting off of me. That's what you're picking up. So I'm looking at the chair in this front row. I'm seeing the light reflecting off that chair. And the way your eye works is that light enters into the front of your eye, your pupil and your cornea, and then your eye actually bends the light so that the back of your eye, the retina, can interpret the light that it's seeing, and it then sends an electromagnetic pulse to your optic nerve in your brain, and then your brain tells you this is what you're seeing in front of you. Isn't that kind of wild? Your eye is like a computer. It's extremely sophisticated and incredible the way that God has made it. But even if you have healthy eyes, if you have 20/10 vision, stop rubbing it in, I can't see anything, but even if you have that, there are plenty of things in the material world that you cannot see with your eye, even if your vision's perfect. There's different frequencies of light that your eye is not made to pick up. There's all sorts of different things in the universe that you can't see. There are different gases that we know they're there because you can smell them, but you can't see them. There's a lot of jokes I can make right now, but I'm not gonna make them. But there's all sorts of things. The electromagnetic field that's all over the universe, you can't see that with your eye for the most part, but it exists. Gravity, you can't see it, but it exists. So my question that I wanna pose to you today is that in the same way, there are things in the material universe that you can't see with your eye, that you can't perceive. Is it possible that there are things that God is doing in your life and in the world around you that you just can't see at the moment? Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. And that's what I want to discuss as we go through this morning. We're gonna be reading from the scriptures about a guy who could see things, or he believed even that they were there when no one else could see them. We're talking about the advent of hope today. And essentially what hope is confidence and assurance of something, even when you can't see it right there in front of you at the moment. Hope doesn't mean, oh man, I wish this is going to happen in the far off future. Biblical hope means I believe it's going to happen, even though I don't see it fully right now at this moment. We're going to be reading about a guy named Elisha. So we're going to be reading in the book of 2 Kings. And for the next couple minutes, I'm going to talk about the most confusing part of this sermon. So you'll have to focus for just a couple minutes. And this guy, Elisha, was a prophet of Israel. He went from place to place, doing what God told him to do and telling the people what God wanted him to tell them. And Elisha saw a lot of things in his life. And a lot of where he saw these incredible things were from his mentor, the person he learned from, whose name was Elijah. So here's what's confusing. I'm talking about two people with essentially identical names. And as I read it, I'm like, God, couldn't you have been more creative in picking the next prophet with a different name? And he said no. He picked who he picked. So anyway, Elisha and Elijah. Now, Elisha watched Elijah do incredible things. Elijah, if you're not familiar, he's the same guy who did a whole bunch of miracles during his lifetime. One of the most notable was he had a showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Basically, they said, whoever's God can burn up this altar on top of the mountain is going to win. And so God sent down fire from heaven, burned up the entire altar, and then burned up the prophets of Baal for good measure, just destroyed them all. Elijah did a series of things like that in his life. And as he got old, God told Elijah, you are not going to be here much longer. I'm going to have you pass on to the mantle to the next guy, Elisha. So before Elijah was gone, Elisha saw a couple of really interesting things. First, he saw an episode in Elijah's life where the king of Israel sent multiple bands of soldiers to try and talk to him, capture him. And several times in a row, Elijah called down fire from heaven, and it destroyed the soldiers of Israel. The even more interesting thing that Elisha saw was God told Elijah, your time here is up. And he said, okay. And Elisha watched as God pulled Elijah up in a whirlwind into the sky. So Elijah didn't even die. He just was taken up to be with the Lord, and Elisha saw that. So my question I would want to pose to you about this is, if you were a young person and you watched those couple of things happen, you saw God burn up all those soldiers, you saw him take your mentor up into the sky, what an incredible way to go, would you have a unique perspective on the world? Obviously, yes, you would. Elisha was attuned to things that God was doing, even when no one else could see them. And the story that we're going to read today in 2 Kings chapter 6, it gives us a really great example of Elisha's keen eye of hope to know things when no one else knew them. So we're going to be reading in 2 Kings chapter 6. Before I pick up reading, I do want to give you some background. There was a king in modern-day Syria, but Aram was what it was called then, who was sending in bands of raiders to attack Israel in different places. They would basically attack, they would kill some people, they would steal their stuff and run away. Well, God started cluing Elisha in on when these raiders were going to come. So Elisha would tell the king of Israel, hey, you might want to station your soldiers here. Some bad guys are about to come. And they would come and they would stop them. And so eventually the king of Aram said, I need to get rid of this Elisha guy. He knows the things that I even whisper in my bedroom. So I need to either capture or kill him. So he takes all of his armies, all of his soldiers, all of his chariots, and he surrounds Elisha in the city that he's in. So that's what we're going to pick up here in 2 Kings chapter 6. It says this is in verse 14. Therefore he, the king, sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to them, alas, my master, what shall we do? So the servant of Elisha wakes up. He was a morning person. Is anyone in here a morning person? A few of you are. I am not. You wake up in the morning, he gets his coffee, he's stretching, so excited about everything that he's going to see in his day, and he looks out and sees hundreds of soldiers with weapons and horses and chariots about to kill the two of them who have no army. So he freaks out, and he goes and tells Elisha. Verse 16. So he answered, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened his eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Elisha knew what was going on, even when no one else could see it. So his servant comes to him and says, we're surrounded. What are we going to do? And Elisha says, don't worry. There's more of us than there are of them. And his servant we don't know what he says here, but I'd assume he'd say something like, what are you talking about? We have no chance. There's two of us. There are hundreds of them. We have less of a chance of beating these guys than the Yankees did to beat the Astros. Am I right? Come on. We have no chance. What are we going to do? And Elisha says, don't worry, there are more of us. And he prays that the Lord would open his eyes, and he opens his eyes, and what he sees is the armies of the Lord, the hosts of angels and their chariots and fiery things all over the mountain. Basically, his eyes are open to see something that no one else could see at the moment. God was doing something, even though the servant couldn't see it and the soldiers of the Aramites couldn't see it, but Elisha knew it was there. So we read this story, and this brings a couple questions to mind for me. One, how did Elisha know what was going on? Two, is it possible for us to know and see some of the things that God is doing, even when no one else around can see it? And then three, why is it that we can't see some of the things that God is doing in the world? If we believe that this story is true and things like it are true, that God is working in the world even when we can't see it, why is it that we can't see it? There's a couple reasons that I want to talk about this. One reason that we can't see everything is that we can't see the things that God has hidden. We can't see the things that God has hidden. There are certain things that God is doing that he is just going to hold close to the vest, and he's not going to tell us what he's doing at that moment. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is speaking to the disciples and others around him, and he says this, "But of that day and that hour," talking about the time of his return, "no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only." Jesus says about the mystery of when he's going to return, no one knows, not the angels, not anyone, just the Father in heaven. I want to repeat that, no one knows. So if anyone is ever going to tell you that they know when Jesus is returning, they're either deluded or lying or a Yankees fan or something like that. There's something wrong with them as they're telling you that. No one knows. There are certain things that just God keeps hidden until the appropriate time comes to reveal it. Paul says something similar in the New Testament. He says there was a mystery for ages that God kept hidden, that the kingdom of God was for all people, not just for the people of Israel. That was a mystery until it was revealed. There's all sorts of different examples of things like that in the Bible, big things that God has hidden. But there are also things in your life specifically that are hidden from you until the right time for them to be revealed. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know here, but we are living in time and in space. You cannot move backward into the past. You can't move forward into the future. There are things that are going to happen to you or for you in your life that you're just not going to know about until the appropriate time for you to see them. I'm going to get a little personal with you and tell you a little bit about my life. I grew up at the Woodway campus of our church, so from the time I was in first grade onward, and I became a believer when I was very young. I was a young boy, and my sister led me to Christ when I was, I think, 6 or 7 years old. I talked to her about what it means to have Jesus in my heart, and she explained it to me, and I prayed to receive Christ. And as I got older, I kept learning and kept growing. I was here at this church, and I would say by the time I was a middle school student, I was a pretty serious believer. I cared about what God wanted for my life. I wanted to please him. I wanted to know him. But what happened for me is that over time, as I got older, I became a teenager, into adolescence, I started to want to know things about my future. I started desiring things for my life. I wanted girls to like me. They didn't. I wanted to know what was going to happen in my future, what I was going to do for a career. And over a long period of time, in the time that I was in high school and in college and even beyond that, I would pray and I would ask the Lord, can you just give me a glimpse of what's coming in my future? Can you just give me just an inkling of maybe who I'm going to marry or what my life is going to look like or what I'm going to do for a job? And it felt in that time kind of like I was stumbling through the dark because I wasn't getting answers about the specifics of what was going to happen for my future. Well, what I decided to do is at some point I just said, okay, it looks like this may not be revealed to me anytime soon, so I'm just going to do the things that I know that God is calling me to do, and I'll just trust him to unfold things the way that they're going to unfold. But it was a struggle all the way through the time when I was a young person, wanting to know, God, what do you have for me coming in my future? And I was stumbling and just didn't know. There's another story of a young girl. She was 12, and she lived in South Korea, and she was in the last summer of being in Korea before her family was going to move to a new country. They were going to move to China. And in that last summer, she was spending some time with one of her good friends, and they were out shopping in an outdoor shopping center. And as happens, some of you may have had this happen to you before, you're shopping in an outdoor place. I hate shopping, so this doesn't happen to me very often. But it started raining. Torrential downpour. So these girls did the first thing that they could do. They ducked into the first building that they could find. Well, when they went into the building, they found that they were in a church. There were these people having a worship service. Neither of these girls were Christians. Their families weren't believers. And one of the girls, the first girl, elbowed her friend. She saw a statue of Jesus in the front, and she said, "What are they doing to that man?" That's what she asked. So she didn't know what was going on. And the people in the church came up to them, and they told them, "We're Christians. We worship Jesus. This is what we do. This is what we live for." Well, when the rain stopped, the second girl said, "Hey, let's go back and start shopping again." But the first girl was intrigued. She wanted to know what was going on. She asked more questions. For the rest of that summer, she continued to go back to that church. And by the end of that summer, she had decided, I'm going to believe this. This is what I'm going to do with my life. It seems like God kind of miraculously put that moment of her life into place where she ducked into a church. Well, over the course of time, she moved to China. She went to school. She met Christians at each place that she lived, but she went to university in China. She got a graduate degree in Hong Kong. She moved to Monterey, California eventually for a second graduate degree. Terrible weather in Monterey, California, if any of you have ever been there. I'm kidding, it's incredible. But she was there, and she went to school, and when she was about to finish, she got a job in a different city, and so she spoke to one of her friends that she knew in Monterey, and she said, "I'm moving to Houston for a job after a little bit of time. Can you tell me maybe a church that I could go to? I know you're from Houston." And the girl said, "Oh yeah, when I was a kid, a long time ago, my dad worked at Second Baptist in Houston, so you should go there." And so this girl said, okay. So she went to Houston, she got an apartment by the Galleria, and she found out Second Baptist Woodway was not far away. So she went to Second, and when she was there, the end of the service came, Pastor Ben was preaching, and they showed the red door over on the side, the front door of the church, the visitor reception, and they said, "If you have any questions, want to meet anyone, come over there." Well, this girl, this young lady, walked over to the visitor reception, and the person that was standing there was the person who is standing in front of you right now. It was me. The person that I'm talking about is my wife. That's her story of how she came to faith years ago in South Korea and then through China and all these things. And the reason I tell you this story is that I was a young person in junior high and high school and college, and in the time that I was asking these questions of God, "God, can you just show me my future? Just tell me who I'm going to marry right now." It was ridiculous that I was asking those questions. God was already working on my wife and on my future way before I could have ever known what he was doing. Think about this. When I was first praying these prayers to God about who am I going to marry, what's my life going to be, my wife didn't even speak English at the time. She was across the world doing all this different stuff, and God had his hand in that situation even when I couldn't see it. There are certain things that God is doing that you just aren't going to know because they're hidden until the time that it comes. But just because you can't see it doesn't mean that God isn't doing anything in your life. The second thing I want to share with you, the reason that we can't see what God is doing, this one's a little more dangerous. We can't see when sin blocks our vision. When you have unattended sin in your life, things that you allow to be there that you just don't get rid of, what it does is it deludes your thinking. It puts you in a situation where you can't differentiate between what is true and what is not. Sin blocks our vision. In the Gospels, Jesus talks about his primary opponents, the Pharisees. And in Matthew chapter 15, he describes them as being blind people trying to guide other blind people. Because of their own pride and their own cultural expectations, their own sin, they couldn't see what was going on in front of them. There's another story in the Old Testament about King Saul, the first king of Israel. And Saul, he couldn't figure out what God wanted him to do if it hit him in the face. The only way that Saul ever knew what God wanted him to do was when the prophet Samuel would tell him. But Saul over and over again disobeyed the Lord, had issues with his pride and his ego. And eventually, when the prophet Samuel died, Saul had already been rejected by the Lord as king. But he was so desperate to want to know what was next, what God had for his life, that he went and consorted with a witch. He asked a witch to raise Samuel's ghost from the dead to tell him what was coming from the future. Does that give you an indication of how blind we can get when sin is there in our life? I heard a story, and it's hilarious, so I want to share it with you. But there was a British naval commander named Horatio Nelson, and he was a very decorated naval commander. I have a quote here from him. "Gentlemen, when the enemy is committed to a mistake, we must not interrupt him too soon." I tell that to Keith Carmichael all the time. Let your enemies make mistakes. But he was this great naval commander, and there was a particular battle, a naval battle, where he was not the person completely in charge, but he was commanding a series of ships. And he was of the conviction that if they were to attack, they would win the battle, but that if they would retreat, they would definitely lose and they would definitely die. So he was convinced of this. Now, he was also convinced that the people that he was listening to giving orders were cowards. And so keep this in mind. He said, if we attack, we win. If we retreat, we die. The instructions he was given was, go ahead and attack, but if you see the signal, the flare sent in the air, when you see that, then retreat. That's what he was told. So the battle happened, and they attack, He looked for the signal, didn't see it, so they attacked and they won the battle. Where after the battle was over, it became apparent that the signal to retreat actually was sent up in the air. But he didn't see it. And so the question is, how? How did he not see it? Well, he was pretty clever. When the battle happened, they had these one-eyed seafaring telescopes that they would have to look for things. Well, when he took that telescope and opened it up, he put it up to the eye in which he was blind. He had a blind eye. He had been wounded in battle years before. So he intentionally put the telescope up to his blind eye so that he wouldn't see the signal and attack. Now, that's a silly story about a commander doing something clever. But if you have an area of sin in your life that you're just letting linger and stay there, what you're doing is you're blinding your eye to see what God might obviously be doing in front of you. Sometimes we ask things of God, God, tell me, what are you doing? What do you want for me to do next? And the thing that's blocking you from being able to see it is that sin that you just let stay there and linger. Maybe you have an angry temperament and you just say to yourself, well, I'm just an angry person by nature. Sometimes I'm gonna be a little short-fused. I'm gonna fly off the handle and unnecessarily yell at the kind old lady at the grocery store, but it's just part of who I am. Or maybe you have a tendency toward being lustful and you just say, God made me this way. There's nothing I can do about it. It's not hurting anyone anyway. No one's gonna know what's happening. The truth of that situation is that if you let that sin stay there and linger, you are not gonna be able to see what God is calling you to do next in your life. Do you think if you have some area of sin that you allow just to sit there and fester, that you're gonna know when God is directing you somewhere else in your life? Are you gonna know when he has someone that he wants you to share your faith with? Probably not. You're probably not gonna see what God is calling you to do if you let sin linger. So we can't see when sin blocks our vision. So we know that we can't see the things that God is hidden from us, things that he's doing that he just doesn't want us to know yet. And we also can't see things that are blocked by our own sin. For the question of how is it that we can come to see what God is doing in the world, I have a really simple thing that I'll share with you in a 1-minute session here. And it's basically this. Discipleship is the key that can help us to see what God is doing in the world. Discipleship trains us to see. Elisha knew how to have the hope that God was surrounding them with his armies because he saw God do miraculous things through Elijah before him. Do you have a person in your life right now who is farther along in their walk with the Lord than you that you can ask questions to, that you can see what they're doing with their life, that you could bring them your struggles to help you understand what's going on? Do you have someone like that in your life right now? If you don't, find one. Are you being discipled by Jesus himself? Are you spending time reading his word, understanding what he's called you to do with your life? The way that you can see what God is doing in the world is by knowing God himself and by being discipled by somebody who's farther along than you are. It's pretty simple. God is doing things even when you can't see it, but you're gonna need help to know when God is moving. I read a story a few years ago, and it was an autobiography of a guy named Andrew Klavan. And Andrew is a tough guy, crime, mystery novelist, but what I read was his autobiography. And Andrew was ethnically Jewish, but he was an atheist as he grew older. He rejected the faith of his family. And eventually, over many years, he came to faith in Christ. It's really an incredible story. It's worth reading if you ever get the chance. But I want to tell you about one little snippet from his life that really stood out to me as I read it. He was in his early mid-20s. He was married. He had just had a child, but he was in a really rough period of his life. He was dealing with all sorts of stuff. He's a writer, a very gifted writer, but he was struggling with all sorts of bad habits that he had in his own life. He was struggling with his work, his writing not being recognized. I mean, he felt a calling to do something, to write and to do things that people would understand, but people weren't connecting with what he was writing. People weren't acknowledging his ability and his genius, which is very relatable to me. I feel like I say these incredible things all the time, and no one ever listens, except y'all have to right now, which is nice for me. But he was frustrated with his life, frustrated with his work, frustrated with everything going on from his past. And he said there was a night where he was sitting in his room, in a dark room, and he came the closest that he ever came to taking his own life. He said he was sitting in a chair, chain smoking, cigarette after cigarette, and he was listening to a baseball game on the radio. Now, for those of you who are young, that is how people used to have to watch sporting events. They would have to listen to them on the radio, which is horrible. I can't even imagine what that was like. But he was sitting there listening to a Mets game, which is double torture. But he was listening to that game, and as he was listening, like I said, he was smoking and smoking and smoking, and he said a worm of a thought made its way into his mind. And that thought was him saying over and over again, I don't know how to live. I don't know how to live. Frustrated with his life, angry with the lack of recognition. I don't know how to live. And so as he's doing that, he's despairing as he sits there. he's listening to this baseball game, and at the end of the game, the Mets ended up winning. The Mets had a catcher named Gary Carter, and was not very fast, had bad knees, and basically he hit a ground ball, and he beat out the ground ball to first base, and the Mets won the game. And so Gary was actually an outspoken Christian. He's kind of like what Tim Tebow would be a little bit now, except a lot less famous and probably less good looking, I'm assuming. But he, at the end of the game, they were interviewing him, and the interviewer said to him, "Gary, you have terrible knees," which that's a great way to start an interview. He said, "You have terrible knees. How is it that you were able to gut out that ground ball and bring your team to win the game?" Now, I mentioned to you, Gary was an outspoken Christian, and a lot of times in interviews, he would say things like he would acknowledge the Lord, thank Jesus for the things that he had done in his life. And if he had said that at that moment, that would not have done anything for Andrew Klavan. He was not in a place to hear that. But what Gary said was something really simple. He said, sometimes you just have to play through pain. That was what he said. And Klavan said when he heard that, it was like a ray of light and hope came into his life. He was sitting there despairing over the existential dread of life. And then all of a sudden, this little truth, sometimes you just have to play through pain. Klavan said, wait a second, I can do that. I know how to play through pain. I've been doing that my entire life. And in that moment, he went from from despair into hope. And writing about this, Andrew Klavan says in his book, he says, at that moment, what I didn't know and what I couldn't see is that all of the things that I was despairing about in my life were about to change in a span of 2 weeks to a month. Everything was going to change. His first work was going to get picked up and published, and he was going to get money as a result of it. He was going to have a major breakthrough in the therapy that he was doing. All these things were going to happen with his family. It was all right around the corner. And in that one moment, he was sitting there despairing, really thinking about taking his own life when he just didn't know. He didn't see what was coming directly after it. And here's the thing that I want to leave you with today. In talking about hope and things that we can't see that are going on in the world, you might be at a moment right now in your life with a relationship or with your work or with whatever it is going on where you have despair over what's happening. I don't know how to live. I don't know what's going to happen next with my life. I don't know if it's even worth it for me to keep doing the things that I'm doing. The thing I want to ask you is this. How do you know that in that moment that you're despairing, that the armies of the Lord are not surrounding you right then at that moment? How do you know that God is not about to do something that you just can't see yet, that might be coming right around the corner? And what we need to do, what we're called to do by the Lord, is to hope and prepare for the things that we know are coming in our future. God makes a whole series of promises to us in the scriptures about what he has in store for those who know him and love him. And there is never a reason for us as believers to despair. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that God is not about to do something huge in your life. So I have one last question for you. Look at your life right now. What do you see? Father, we are thankful for the ways that you speak to us in your word. We are thankful for all the things that you're doing in the world, the things that we can see and the things that we can't see. Father, if there's anyone here this morning that needs to hear from you, that needs to know you, that needs to have hope for the future, I pray that you would stir them and bring them to you today. We pray these things in Jesus' name.